Just initially, to start things off, I'm going to hand over to Ross briefly, who's going to give us an overview of the Design Society for those of you who may not be affiliated presently. Cool. So over to Ross.
Hi everyone, welcome to the session today. So the Design Society is an interdisciplinary community of academics, industry practitioners with the goal of developing and promoting a robust, usable and scalable means of designing solutions to complex problems that a sustainable and globalised society needs to thrive in the 21st century. We are 900 plus current members around the world in 48 different countries. And what we are about is interaction with peers, junior, senior and design researchers and also practitioners, giving you access to research papers and thesis, awareness of events, calls and jobs, reduced publication fees if you are an author, reduced event registration fees at our sponsored events, and also the opportunity to develop your career. If you are a young researcher, we also have PhD summer schools, which we can offer discount to, young members events, interaction with your peers, and different types of resources for young members. If you do have a special interest that you're interested in terms of design research, we have all these different special interest groups, and you might find one that aligns with you. And also for more information, you can go straight to the website at designsociety.org.
Super, thank you very much, Ross. Great, so hopefully a useful overview for anyone who's not familiar with the Design Society. So I'd now like to introduce our host for today's session, Dr. Ricardo Sosa Medina from Auckland University of Technology. Ricardo has over 20 years of experience in design research, teaching and practice. His interests can be grouped around the creative and critical design of technology. Ricardo's work spans across numerous different disciplines and methods, and he's published extensively in a variety of different research outputs with over 60 different co-authors. Ricardo is very passionate about working with other specialists in order to enact ethical social impact through creative ideas and through responsible uses of technology. So he's a very apt individual to be hosting today's discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to the brief number of slides he'll be talking us through, and then the following conversations that will follow suit. So just a little bit of housekeeping to say, just prior to Ricardo starting, if you have questions or thoughts or comments that prop up in your mind, please post them in the chat, and then following that discussion, we'll run through and we will moderate a bit of discussion there. Super. So without much further ado then, over to Ricardo. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Let me just check I'm not on mute. That's the thing. Thank you. I thought of this session, we could do something more, something open and participatory, because I'm not an ethicist, and perhaps we have some ethicists in the audience and in the group. But I think that because of the topic and the urgency and the relevance today, I think we all need to be a little bit ethicists in what we do. So this is coming from someone interested in design, research and practice and teaching, talking some reflections to open the conversation around how I think we all need to be thinking and sharing ideas about ethics in design. So I wanted to start just with the what I think is a very weird distinction between hard and soft skills. But I think it's worth mentioning them, because in hard skills, I'm not saying that they are easier or anything, but one way to distinguish between hard and soft skills, so-called, which are terms that have its own history that is interesting, is whether the tools that you use to solve a problem are well defined, and that would be in the terrain of hard skills, or whether those tools and the end state of what you're doing is not well defined, and therefore it requires a lot of your agency and your values and your reflectivity to achieve, and those would be soft skills. And basically a lot of that happens, of course, in the interface between what we design and the world. And so that's a way of starting with some distinction. I would like to invite everyone in the session to adhere to this plan with 3 basic rules. I think we all have ongoing ideas, ongoing beliefs from our experiences, from what we've done before about ethics. My first suggestion is that we suspend those previously held beliefs for a moment, just momentarily, we suspend them, that we actively listen to each other, and that we use that as a way of reflecting and forming new ideas. So if we do this well, I feel that by the end of this hour, a lot of us would have new angles, new positions, new ways of looking at things. So this is just 2 more or less recent cases, the VW Dieselgate and of course the Boeing 737 MAX, 2 crashes that led to, in both cases, uncovering a lot of practices that were going, including design practices and managerial practices that were going on in these big corporations, that I think they are not the exception, or perhaps they were the exception in the gravity of the occurrences. But I think that every day you open the newspaper, you see instances of deep questions that we need to ask ourselves about how we conduct what we do in an ethical and humane way. So I thought that we could use this interview from a couple of years back, where Courtney Martin asks Tim Brown from IDEO his opinion about our ethical mandate as designers. And I think it's a long interview, around half an hour, but it's interesting to concentrate on this particular question because it leads to 2 different answers. And so I'm quoting here, of course, just some excerpts from the 2 answers. And the first answer he gave, I think it was quite unsatisfactory, and it created a lot of discussion, especially like in social media like Twitter, between designers. And he was saying, well, if we make that oath, the Hippocratic oath, like doctors do, to first do no harm, then we would likely never do anything new. That was his kind of like line of reasoning. And then he says, I would hate for designers to feel like we can't ever engage in something that's unknown because we're worried about what the outcomes might be. So his reaction was like, we wouldn't have innovation if we adhere to the principle of do no harm, which of course is a very flawed way of thinking. And as I said, there were a lot of comments on social media, but in particular, this person, and the link is there, Per Axbom, this was in July last year. He wrote a more complete analysis of Tim Brown's response, and he reveals like some curious assumptions behind his responses. So, and adherence to the Hippocratic Oath would mean that there is no innovation. And of course, he says medicine has seen a lot of innovation, even if doctors do adhere to making no harm. Being ethical means taking no risks. And he says, well, no, there is no intervention in medical practice that doesn't involve risk-taking. And of course, he challenges this idea that doing nothing is what creates the least harm. So he sort of like deconstructs Tim Brown's response, which I think he did a pretty good job. We can talk about more about that. I think as professionals who are in charge of often producing innovation, new types of solutions, new types of responses that affect others in new ways, not knowing exactly what the consequences will be as it happens in innovation. I think those are interesting talking points. And so for anyone who has seen this American comedy, The Good Place, I think it's a good reminder that these problems are not simple. These problems are quite complex, and it's not just as easy as saying, "Oh, now we've designed electric cars. Now we can absolutely certainly say that they are better than petrol cars," because in many ways they are sold as innovations. They especially in the design world, we tend to see these things as innovations, but in many ways, they are innovations to maintain the status quo. So private car ownership doesn't change. And therefore, the environmental impact of manufacturing these vehicles and disposing of their tires and the infrastructure they need in terms of roads, all of that stays the same, whilst only maybe addressing the most visible impact. And so this made me think of the drug development process. Some industries are they're well-established industries that have very clear kind of like rules for innovation or for creating new solutions. So this is, I guess, the prototypical case. The drug development process takes 6-7 years to generate one FDA-approved drug. And this is kind of like a funnel starting from 10,000 compounds and then animal testing and then testing. And I think we all have become more aware of this now with the production of the research and production of vaccines for COVID-19. So that's one aspect of it, kind of like following due diligence in terms of the design process and making sure that we test, obviously not on animals, hopefully, that we ethically test our ideas before we launch them to the market. But what I thought was more interesting here is that after the drug is released to the market, these industries have a process to follow up. And this is the second part of Tim Brown's response to that question of what is the ethical mandate. And he said, and this part, to be honest, I thought was a very a much better crafted response than the first one he gave. He says we have to engage with a commitment to stay involved, and he sort of like refers to the fire and forget way of designing that was predominant in the 20th century. We finish our design, we launch it into the world, and then it's someone else's problem. And he says that mindset is destructive now because these things don't stay in the same state that we designed them. They continue to evolve. And I think that's very insightful because, again, going back to our drug development process, there are systems in place, such as the FDA in the US. They have this system where professionals, but also the public, can report medical devices and drugs and medicines for their unforeseen effects. And so I thought this case example was interesting, very recent. A company that withdrew products from the shelves, from the market, because the packaging, so this was some hand sanitizer, but the packaging resembled a juice box or some sort of sweet. And so the risk was there that children were possibly confused and ingesting this hand sanitizer because of the packaging. So it was withdrawn from the market because of that resemblance. So this is, I guess, an instance of that kind of like following up and being responsible for the effects. Some of them can be indirect effects. Some of them can be very direct effects, but they can be not visible at the time of designing and staying with the problem. And I think, as I said, there are industries that have these regulations in place. But of course, there are other industries, and we've seen with social media, for instance, and technologies, digital technologies, that we don't have that infrastructure. And of course, there are many initiatives around the world to add some regulation to these industries because people can make a lot of decisions without really understanding what, or without even being responsible for its effects. So this slogan by Facebook, move fast and break things, and of course they broke democracy. I'm going to close with this. So this is turning to our design philosophers for some ideas on how to move forward. And this is a book chapter by Don Ede, the designer Fallacy and Technological Imagination, that I would recommend for people to read. Of course, I'm not going to do justice to it in just a few minutes, but the main two ideas from this book chapter is that so he calls a designer fallacy this notion that a designer can design into a technology, like fully design into a technology, its purposes and its uses. And he says, well, now the situation is much more complex and less transparent than that. And he points out two things that are co-responsible for the effects of our designs. One is what he calls the materiality, or the technology itself, and recognizing that materials and technology, the hard stuff with which we design, can also have quote-unquote affordances, or features that determine its impact. And also, of course, how users use what we design, our propositions. So, of course, design being defined as an intentional change-making activity, but intentions are not good enough. So taking this idea from philosophy that the technology itself has effects that we cannot predict, maybe because of issues of scale or interactions with other technologies or interactions with the context. And of course, users have agency in different geographical regions and different social settings and so on. And so those factors are important in shaping how a technology behaves. And both intended results and unintended results are essentially unpredictable. And I think that would have some implications for how we think about design, how we teach design, and how we study design. So I'm going to finish with this, this list of some points that I think are worth talking about. Intentions not being enough in the design, in the role of designers. Often discussions about ethics often fall into very simplistic kind of like, if the technology falls in the wrong hands, or, like goodies and baddies. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that some of the worst effects of technology and design have been on perfectly well-intended solutions, right? And even solutions that we would call successful, but they have had possibly created many more problems for those people or for other people that we were not thinking about. I think the second point, to question who are involved, is a really profound. I think it's a simple one because we use it all the time, like when we define stakeholders. But I often believe that how we define stakeholders can be substantially improved if we think about politics, and if we think about culture and power relationships in society. To seek full and informed consent, I think that is another. Designers we often believe that we know better and that we can make choices for other people, and I think that is very problematic. It has been very problematic from design. Looking out for assumptions, what we believe, what has worked before. I would seriously challenge the notion that designers can be empathic. I think we've been overused that word in ways that have been more damaging than useful. Obviously, being able to look at big picture and scale effects. And here is just a thought: the way design history, for instance, is taught. I'm not a design historian either, but the way design history is taught in schools, in design schools, it's just one example, I feel, of places where ethics haven't been that prominent. We haven't really, I think, integrated ethics into the curriculum in general. Empathy, for instance, as well, suggests that when we teach studio, design projects or design studio, that would be also an interesting space to open with the students about really who gets to call what empathy. To look for indirect negative consequences and trade-offs. That's also another area for, I think, to develop some ideas. Maybe to expand our idea of designing as problem solving and into well-being, and how that reshapes what we do. And ultimately, well, the last point, to open and document ethical decisions. So with that, I'm going to stop there, hopefully provoke some ideas. I don't pretend that I have answers, but I have more questions than I had before. And hopefully as a group, we can share some more ideas. Yeah, to you.
Super, thank you, Ricardo. really interesting stuff. That's very, very engaging. And I've scribbled down half a dozen different things that I would like to talk about. Lots of different ideas fizzing around as a result. But in the first instance, I'll hand over to see if there's anything that's coming from the broader group. So do we have anything that anyone would like to raise? And I should just mention, do bear in mind that it's being recorded. So if you're perhaps not comfortable speaking verbally, you're more than welcome to use the chat to raise your questions.
I have a question I could ask, and while people are typing things in the chat, it's probably quicker than me typing it. So thank you very much firstly for the presentation, Ricardo. I think that was really interesting, and I think there's some things in there that I really agree with, and then some things that maybe I don't agree with, and some things I haven't thought about before. But I guess my first question is that ethical means different things to different people. And I like this idea of like having a Hippocratic oath for design, but who defines what ethical means in design, and how do we come to an agreement on that? And yeah, how do we solve that problem, first of all, in terms of all of these different perspectives, and how we can come to a common perspective on that?
Oh, that's a very easy question. I have the answer. No, of course not. I think that's ultimately the big question. The bigger question is how we define it, who defines it, who gets to define it, for whom. My humble kind of like non-response, my way out of it is, I think we all, at this moment, because products and services, technologies are getting so complex, increasingly complex, and so many people are, this is no longer the case where the designer or even the design team makes the decisions, and then that's it, right? There are departments and there are stakeholders and partners and agencies like regulation agencies, and like it's so entangled, the decision making that goes ultimately into a feature of a product or a technology, that it's becoming messier and messier to distinguish who's making bad decisions when and why. And my personal kind of like ideology, my personal position is, I'm pretty sure most people mean well. Even, and it's hard to say that, even when you get like the VW Dieselgate or the 737 MAX disasters that cost lives, or that GMC SUV that we saw in the beginning. So it's more like a chain of decisions going bad, I think, and conditioning, putting not even people, but putting a design, let's say, into a direction that even the best intended person is going to add to that problem, right? So honestly, my no answer right now would be, all of us, especially those engaged in education, I think we need to urgently start thinking of ethics and seeing ourselves as ethicists in a way. Like, I think we don't need to be experts in ethics and read the ancient Greeks, but to almost every day when we go into the classroom, when we talk to a client, when we send a grant proposal, I think we ought to pause and think, who am I not seeing here? Who am I not listening to? Who am I ignoring? Who has been ignored from this problem? And how am I perpetuating that? Even if, of course, I didn't mean it, but how am I, obviously that's not an answer, I'm sorry.
No, it's great, it's great. Yeah, I agree. I think education is really fundamentally important, because that's ultimately where we create the designers of the future, I guess. So I completely agree with you, and the idea as well that I think most people are well-intentioned. I don't think people set out to be unethical. So yeah, no, it was a great answer. Thank you.
Great. Super, thank you. Just to to further that point a little bit as well, the question of responsibility in design is a very apt one. And if you think about it, theoretically, it could sit at a number of different levels. Is it really at the responsibility of a governmental level, an organizational level, a design practitioner level, or a consumer level? And there are subtleties to what could be involved in any one of those. And depending on your philosophy, your cultural perspective, you will have a different interpretation of where that might rest potentially. But it's certainly a very interesting direction to be headed towards when we consider this in a more active element from a designer's perspective. So just jumping into a couple of points from the chat here. We've got a question on Ricardo, just how would you, in your estimation, like to bring in the conversation of ethics into the design process?
How do we bring the I think right from the beginning, so it worries me that the way we teach design these days in design schools, it hasn't really substantially changed, and I'm happy to be challenged on that. But my belief from what I've seen across the world is new design programs, new design schools, or old design schools with new design programs, but they tend to maintain like a core, the core of design education hasn't really changed. And maybe for good reasons, like there is a strong influence still from the Bauhaus, right? I feel that it's a problem itself because how we become designers. I became a designer. I think it's an interesting idea that you study design and therefore you become a designer. I think that's another philosophical point to talk about. But to me, it happened in the 90s, early 90s. That's a long, long time ago. And I see how most design schools are educating designers and substantially hasn't really changed. Whereas the world from the 90s, I mean, the internet happened and, you know, like so many things happened from the 90s. Again, it's not really a response, but it's, I think, helping, hopefully helping all of us to think about this. Again, I would say how we teach design theory, how we teach design history, how we teach drawing, how we teach materials, how we teach every single thing that we teach in design. I would hate to see design programs having an ethics class, right? Because then you hire the ethicist, and I mean, it's great to have experts, but I think that person or that profile shouldn't have their own course. I think that person should be in the studio, that person should be working with theory and history and methods and like across the board, just to ask those, you know, those uncomfortable questions like, why have you thought of this when you say that, or when you do that, and when you transmit this way of thinking to the next generation, have you thought of the consequences? Yeah, that would be my call.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so there's opportunities at an educational level, certainly, and I would agree. I would tend to agree. I think that's where we have a greater degree of influence, particularly when we consider the next generation. My apologies, this is going to look a little bit odd, but the motion sensor light in my room has just gone off. I'm not having a moment, I'm just triggering it again. So great, thank you very much. Just coming back to another point from the chat as well, and actually this does link into the previous point as well, that there are several different principles or practices that are deemed to be ethical, and they vary in different domains, regions, and in cultures. But do you think that there are any underlying sort of timeless behaviours that are enduring from an ethical perspective by which people should, or rather designers should abide?
That's an interesting, it's an interesting thinking point, I think, and talking point for all of us. Because there is this widespread belief that there are universal principles for everything. And my only problem with that, of course, as many other people, is that often who's defined what is universal is a very, very specific culture. It's a very specific, not an ethnicity, but a bunch of like different groups of people, but located in a very particular region, historically, in terms of time and space, that has come up with universal principles, whether that is perception or cognition, or in this case, ethics. And I would just be worried that in defining those timeless or universal ideas, that we fall into colonizing practices of, you need to think like I do because I feel this is timeless. So I think, I don't know, I feel that I would love to see design schools in particular, but also professional settings, working with their contexts, you know. And of course, we go into the topic of globalization and how products that are designed here in Hamilton are actually being sold everywhere in the world. And how does that mean, like, what does that mean in terms of working locally and in those kind of like values? That's a big point to think, I think, for all of us. But I feel that hopefully what is going on right now is, rather than me trying to answer questions, is us as a group together kind of like wanting to think together about these things.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for your response, on that note, and hopefully it's not too much of a segue, but you were veering towards the idea of how things can be competitive in a global environment. Something that I've been thinking about a little bit as well has been the idea of, as much as there can be a propensity for greenwashing in some product design and in some entrepreneurial endeavors, where you're banking on the idea that particular consumers will respond to a particular line of branding or inquiry. I also wonder if these days there's such a thing, and it's a term I've been bouncing around a little bit recently, about the idea of conscience washing, that certain product lines might advocate that they are an ethical or a quote unquote ethical company, but in many cases that's really only determined by that organization's own statements regarding corporate social responsibility, which aren't really benchmarked against anything standardized or universal. So that's something that I've been thinking about a fair little bit recently. It's this idea of how much of that can sometimes be, as I would say, conscience washing is the kind of the idea that I've had a little bit of recently. And I wonder how much of that is prevalent and how much of that is, I genuinely think it's done with the best of intentions. Coming back to the idea of intentions, which has been a bit of a recurring theme of the discussion so far. So I just wonder if that's something that anyone else has any thoughts upon.
I see a Western Baxter raising a hand.
Cool. Okay.
Thanks so much, Ricardo, and great provocation. I think I'm kind of coming back a little bit to, Ricardo, what you were saying before. I'm really curious about, I think it's a really critical topic to talk about, this colonization and making sure that we're not, telling people how to think just because it's how we think. But of course, we also do that all the time, and we do formalize rules and regulations. And so I'm really interested in that boundary. And while we shouldn't be colonizing, we do formalize rules. And certainly you started with a great provocation, the comment from Tim Brown on that, and serious conversations going about should we have oaths that we adhere to, and should we ask that all designers adhere to this? So again, I think I'm trying to respond to your provocation rather than answering something or asking something. Just, I think that boundary is so fascinating, and different disciplines are at different stages of formalization within that. And certainly design is an interesting stage as well, of even publishing, right? Do people have ethics clearance to publish their research, or have they not done any ethics clearance in the institution where they reside to conduct the research in the first place, which would be unheard of in several disciplines now. So anyway, that boundary is fairly fascinating to me.
Yes, thank you, Weston. That's a very valid point.
Yeah, super valid. And I would just follow up with, because we're in the context of the Design Society, I have a feeling, but it might be more of a hope, that in the future more research in seemingly unrelated areas within design start including some more awareness about the ethical dimensions, because there is this, I teach research methods here in the university, and I see often with, let's say more scientific kind of like natural sciences kind of like researchers almost believing, oh, well, I'm dealing with the strength properties of materials. Therefore, I don't need ethics clearance, and I don't need to think about ethics because I'm working with metals and polymers. And I just hope that in the future we see more crossovers and more being informed from an ethical perspective, that everything we do has an ethical dimension to it.
And if I can just jump in on that, I think that's such a valid point, and you hit on this really nicely with the comment you made about, you know, how does ethics fit into the education, and really the answer, hopefully in my mind as well, is everywhere, not just in a one-off class. But you know, I think especially within design, a lot of institutional ethics procedures are set up for human studies or animal studies. They're not set up for technologies that could be destructive, or ideas that could be destructive, and services that could have negative effects, which is a lot of the stuff that we deal with. And I think that's another really important reason why it needs to be an integral part of what we teach.
Absolutely, thank you. I can see that Laura has a hand raised as well. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to what you're saying there about institutional ethics boards. I mean, we have an issue sometimes in my department where we have students who do design projects in their senior years, and they want to work with users and do research in the beginning of the design process. And the whole process, although I think it's great for them to think about ethics, and of course they need to, and to go through these approval processes, it's so protracted and so complicated and so not set up for design work that it ends up just completely strangling the whole project, and the whole thing falls through. So I don't really have a question, it was more just a comment on, I think it's something that we need to think about in institutions that teach design, that sometimes these processes and these boards are not really set up for the kind of work that we do.
Well, if we're being a little bit cynical, I'm not sure that they're set up as ethics boards solely, but also as you know, litigation mitigation endeavors, right? Yeah. And I mean, to be ethical in the sight of what people really care about. And I think we might start seeing more emphasis on technological pressure, maybe on institutions as the years come on.
Yes, absolutely. And quite often it's been a question of the fact, sometimes you will find in design-orientated programs that the process has not been designed with that in mind. So it may just be an element of the process is not unnecessarily litigious, but it can be excessively litigious, or it's a question of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole in some cases, that it's really not been its intended purpose. Super, great, excellent. So just another point that occurred to me in the process of chatting has been the idea of where do we see, we talked towards the end of your slides, Ricardo, about the idea of co-responsibilities, and this was raised in the context of the designer fallacy. In the context of the designer's fallacy, I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, if that's possible.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking across my teaching and across my research in terms of this fallacy. I think it's fascinating just to think in terms of users, recognizing users' agency. And again, when we learn design and when we practice design, especially not so much with disasters, because that's kind of like an easy one, but when we use it to explain successful products or successful technologies, we tend, I think maybe our brain capacity is quite limited, and we tend to associate a successful technology, a successful product, with what the designer did or what the designers did. And we attribute success and also obviously also failure to what the designers did. And I think this is just basically just an invitation, just a provocation to revise that causal chain and to rethink, hold on, maybe the reason something was really successful had only partially to do with what the designers did, what the decisions the designers made during the design process. Maybe a good percentage of that success had to do with things that happened after the designer's control, outside of the designer's control. We're working on some computational simulations to try to explain this or try to illustrate this in more tangible ways. But I think it just shows a way of thinking of how we attribute the effects of the decisions we make as designers.
Absolutely, yep. And so, in that case, perhaps circling somewhat at a tangent to another point is perhaps looking at it from a slightly different perspective. What do we think could have been done differently in the case of, let's for instance take the example of the hand sanitizer product that we looked at? Is there anything we think could have been done differently which would have prevented that from becoming an unsuccessful product? And is there something that could have been taken into consideration at some part in the process? And again, there are questions there regarding who should do so. A designer may feel that it's actually someone else's responsibility to do that kind of checking and mitigation for those aspects of things, or is it the responsibility of each designer to try to bear those kind of potential consequences in mind? Or a combination thereof. Is there something that could have been done differently that would have prevented that from becoming an unsuccessful product? And it's a good example, but there are many as well.
Yeah, I have something to say there, and I think, forgive me, I like to be provocative. I think sometimes we think about these like great ideas, like at an abstract level, and it's all great. I love a bit of philosophy and spending time really thinking deeply about things. But at other times, the answer might be just in front, like across, in front of us. And I think this is one occasion like that. I don't know. I would love to hear more experiences from people in the room. But my experience as a Mexican designer, when I look back and I reflect, who goes to a design school? Who is attracted to a design school? And this is even clearer in architecture schools, but let's stay with design schools. It's a very specific, tends to be a very specific segment of society, right? It tends to be urban, middle class to wealthy families. I see that. I've seen that in Singapore. I've seen that in Australia. I've seen it here in New Zealand. I've seen it in Mexico, and I've seen it in Ecuador. I've seen it in Panama. I've seen it in many places around the world. Maybe I've just been unlucky finding the exceptional cases. But here, for instance, we're having this conversation in the university I work at the moment, because we attract, and by the way, I'm not in a design program, I'm in a creative technologies program. We have a design school, but that's a topic for an event that is not being recorded. We attract students from high decile high schools. The New Zealand Ministry of Education divides schools in deciles, and that has a lot of social and cultural impacts. And it has to do with funding, but of course, at the end, it has more to do with other socioeconomic divides. And most of our students come from wealthy schools, from wealthy backgrounds. And when we get, I think it's only 10% when we get from the lowest deciles, they tend to not complete. So I guess this is a very long way of saying design needs to be a lot more inclusive and a lot more diverse, because oftentimes we get men designing products for women, just like we designed the law for women. And again, a narrow specific cultural group making decisions, designing for a bunch of other cultural groups. So for someone, even in this simple example, as Ian says, the packaging, I can say that just looking at things from a parent point of view, as compared to how I design, and I design a lot of things for children, including exhibitions for a children's science museum. And now that I go to, or when we used to be able to go to museums with my daughter, like I see the exhibits and I remember how I was designing them before I became a parent. And honestly, you're just not aware of so many emotions and so many feelings that the parent feels with the toddler is climbing a structure to go in this big slide. When you don't know that, you design it and you feel like, oh yeah, he or she is going to feel great coming down. But now as a parent, you realize that you're actually designing for also the parent who is watching that. And the panic that you feel, your 2-year-old climbing that structure, but also the realization that this little person is growing and is taking a dare, a challenge. And anyway, I'm expanding, but inclusivity and diversity, I think, is super important.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's interesting other subtopics that spin out from that particular point as well, and looking at the idea of what are the motivations and the ambitions behind people who are involved in the practice of design, and are they really practicing good design, where ethical design is arguably a subset of good design, and they're taking the appropriate measures and steps to employ appropriate methodologies that, even if they are not a parent themselves, if we stick with the example of a parent, that they are putting themselves in that environment, in that individual's shoes, and really considering it from the correct perspective rather than their own perspective or ambition and drive. I think there can sometimes be an element there of I talk to some students in various different places around the world, and there is kind of a sensation of everyone wants to be the next Elon Musk, or they want to be the next Steve Jobs. Mm-hmm. And for better or worse, that's kind of how they get into it, and then that ambition might carry them through things as well. But I do sometimes wonder about whether that motivation is really facilitating good design practice and allowing them to be empathetic, if we come back to the phrase that you mentioned in your slides in particular. And I realize that in itself could become another very extensive conversation. But I do see that Laura has raised a hand as well, so I'll just hand things over to Laura just now.
It was just to come back to the initial question that sparked that discussion off at you, and that you asked about what else could have been done potentially to prevent that problem from occurring in the first place. And I was thinking about how, when I teach my students and we do things like brainstorming and we teach them ideation methods and how to come up with potential solutions to problems, and how we don't really teach them to think about potential problems from those solutions that they're generating, and to think about unintended negative consequences, and how I feel like they're almost kind of like biased towards what they perceive to be good stuff, and they don't ever think about possible negative things. So one thing that I did with a group of my students this year was like a kind of just future thinking activity, where I tried to get them to think about the fact that it's not all positive stuff. There's negative things as well that can happen. And I know that I totally agree with what Ricardo was saying earlier about you can't predict every possible consequence of a design, good and bad, but maybe we also need to teach our students to think a little bit more about potential negative unintended consequences of things, rather than just all the solutions to the problem.
Absolutely. I think an interesting example in that light would be, for instance, if we take Starlink. So if we look at the ambition of that project, it's hugely beneficial. It's going to revolutionize the range of people who have access to telecommunications and arguably create a more connected world. However, that has, or rather is in the process of forever changing the night sky. Mm-hmm. And who owns the night sky? And is the idea of even trying to consider the idea of who owns the night sky in itself, even asking that question, that's coming from a particular cultural perspective. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely an element there, and that's a particularly poignant example, I think. And we consider particular cultures and populations as well, where that is a hugely negative thing to have happened. So yeah, I mean, I think it's to follow on from your point, I think it's something we should definitely be attempting to be mindful of and be attempting to foster a greater awareness of.
Elon Musk has good form for that kind of thing as well. The other one is the neural waste, which I always look at and go, is that a good thing? I don't know.
Just summarizing a little bit of what you both said there, I think it's really interesting. And it's not something new, but to think of the ego of designers and how we attract, perhaps we attract individuals who want to do, they mean well and they want to do good, but also they want to look good while they do that, right? So that ego part. And I also wonder how much we cultivate that in design circles as well. And to Laura's point, I think absolutely you need to be an optimist to want to create a future. Like there is enough pessimism and yeah, you need to be a bit of a believe in a utopia in a way that you want to improve things. But how do you combine that with the sourness of realizing that that not everything is going to be better necessarily, and how do you account for that? Those are open questions, I feel. But I love this conversation because I think we're finding very kind of like actionable points at different levels of action that we could take.
Yeah, I think the whole conversation has hopefully been very eye-opening, and it's certainly giving me lots to think about as well. And I think it's yes, I completely appreciate the point. Yeah, you need to have a sense of optimism about things, absolutely. And I think actually in the process of wanting to become a designer or to study design, I think there is definitely an inherent sense of optimism there. I think people, as we've kind of suggested at various points throughout the discussion, do have, in most cases, the best of intentions, but that it is important to be mindful that it's possible to be negligent as well. Whether it's through intent or not, it's still possible to be negligent in design, and that potentially could be an issue. Yeah, without trying to sound too pessimistic on that point.
In terms of awareness, and this is completely ironic that I say this right now, but personally, one of the things that really changed my whole perspective on things was the ability to travel, and the ability not to travel as a tourist, but the ability to live in other places, and the ability to to spend time with people from other cultures. And I'm shocked when I hear of people who Auckland, for instance, is a hyper diverse city, much more than sometimes people realize. That certainly I didn't realize it was so diverse until I landed here. But it's also very segregated, like many other diverse places. So you can perfectly grow up in Auckland. I've seen people who have grown up in Auckland and not be exposed to that ethnic diversity. So I think even in your own neighborhood now, in the next couple of years, that will be difficult to travel. Even just getting to know your neighbors and getting to know the neighbors of your neighbors, so a bit further from your immediate neighborhood, could be, I think that, I don't know, there is something that is very hard to pinpoint, but there is something about seeing other values in action and other ways of looking at the world. And then you come back and you realize that everyone's families are weird. There is no such thing as normal.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I'm just conscious. I've got one eye on the clock as well, so I just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to kind of close things out. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions and what has been a very enjoyable discussion, and hopefully it may lead to some future discussions as well. But I just briefly want to try to hand back to Ricardo, just in case there's any concluding thoughts that we might like to wrap up on before closing the session.
Thank you, Ian. Not really, just I think just to amplify this idea that in these difficult times, these are certainly difficult times for everyone around the world. And so I appreciate Laura for organizing this, Ross for helping with the organization, Ian for chairing the session, Weston for his contributions, and everyone who was here. Thank you for making the time and the space, and hopefully we keep in touch and we keep thinking about these ideas and hopefully turning them into actions and examples. I loved Laura's initiative to share what we are doing and learning from each other. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much again to everyone who's been involved. And I think we'll bring the session to a close now. But thank you again. And lastly, again, a very big thank you to Ricardo as well for hosting. That's been wonderful. So it's been a pleasure from my perspective. Thank you all very much. And I hope you have a good, enjoyable day. In our case, Ricardo, and a good evening for everybody else. Super. Cheerio. Thank you very much.
Thank you.